Life in the neighborhood after the verdict shifted in ways I hadn't expected. So while Karen had once dominated the community with her constant surveillance and bullying presence, now there was a palpable silence around her house blinds,
He's my service
perpetually
animal.
drawn
Please calm
in the
down.
front lawn, slowly growing wild as though she had lost the will to keep up the performance of control she had spent years maintaining. Your neighbors, who once avoided me out of fear of being targeted themselves, began to greet me warmly, stopping to pet Max and offer words of encouragement, their relief at her downfall as clear as my own. At first, I tried to settle back into a rhythm of normal life, tending my garden, taking Max on long walks, and rebuilding the sense of peace her harassment had stolen. But every so often, I'd get a letter from the federal investigator handling the HOA violation, reminding me that this wasn't simply a closed chapter. It was part of a larger effort to enforce the rights of people with service animals. I realized that my fight had meaning far beyond my street. Karen, meanwhile, became something of a cautionary tale. Whispers spreading among neighbors about the fines she owed, the restraining order preventing her from approaching me or Max, and the very real possibility of federal charges looming over her head. And though she tried, once or twice, to rant online about being persecuted by corrupt courts, the evidence and judgment against her left her isolated, her usual allies too wary of being associated with her to defend her anymore. One afternoon, weeks after the ruling, I sat on my porch watching Max nap in the sunlight when Mrs. Thompson came by with a basket of fresh-baked bread, smiling in a way I hadn't seen in years, and she said, "You know, you didn't just win. For yourself, you won for all of us." And I realized she was right, because the neighborhood felt lighter, freer, without Karen's constant interference. The HOA itself began to change too. Spurred on by testimony in court, several members resigned, and the remaining board called for a full election, inviting homeowners to run for seats in an effort to rebuild trust. And though I had no desire to join the board myself, I supported neighbors who stepped up with the promise of fairness, accountability, and transparency, all of which had been absent under Karen's influence. Watching the transformation was both surreal and satisfying, because it showed that even one person standing up against abuse of power could spark wider change. And though I had been terrified when it all began, the outcome was proof that doing nothing would have allowed the cycle to continue unchecked. But despite the progress, the final chapter of Karen's saga came in a way none of us anticipated when the federal authorities officially filed charges related to the attack on Max, citing violations of the Americans with Disabilities Act and animal cruelty statutes. And though Karen tried to plead ignorance and argue that she didn't know Max was a service dog, the evidence of his vest, the reports, and multiple eyewitness accounts dismantled that excuse quickly, leaving her two-faced penalties that went beyond fines into potential probation and a permanent criminal record. The day the news broke, neighbors gathered quietly in front yards, shaking their heads in disbelief that her obsession with control had escalated so far that it had now marked her life permanently. And though there was no joy in seeing someone fall so completely, there was a deep sense of justice that she was finally accountable for the harm she had caused. For me, the victory was not only legal, but personal. Max was thriving again, his confidence fully returned, his tail wagging as he worked and played. A living reminder that resilience could overcome cruelty, and I felt proud that I had not allowed fear to silence me when so much was at stake. And yet, even as I closed the door on Karen's reign of intimidation, I knew this wasn't the end of the story, but the beginning of something larger, because every time someone stood up to abuse, every time a community confronted injustice, instead of bowing to it, the message spread wider. Bullies might be loud, but justice is louder. If you've been following this journey, you know how powerful it is when ordinary people refuse to be silenced. And that's why I want you to stick with us for the stories yet to come, because there are so many more battles like this playing out behind closed doors in neighborhoods across the country, and together we can shine a light on every single one. So don't miss what comes next. Make sure you hit that subscribe button to the Sham Stories YouTube channel. Join this community of voices who believe in standing up for what's right, and be ready for the next story that will leave you questioning, outraged, and inspired all at once, because this fight isn't just mine, It's ours. By the time the court date finally arrived, tension in the neighborhood was almost tangible. Every interaction seeming to carry the weight of the months of conflict that had built up between Karen, myself, and the wider community. And as I walked into the courthouse with Max at my side, his service vest neatly fastened and his gait calm and steady, I could feel dozens of eyes on us, not just from curious strangers, but from several of my neighbors who had chosen to attend in quiet support. Their presence a silent rebuke to Karen's attempts to isolate me. And when I glanced back and saw Mrs. Thompson clutching a folder of notes she had prepared to testify about Karen's harassment, I felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude that I wasn't alone in this fight. The courtroom itself was a stark contrast to the chaos Karen usually thrived in. Here her theatrics and shouting wouldn't earn her sympathy, and as the judge entered and the proceedings began, the weight of the evidence started to unfold piece by piece. From the police reports documenting the vandalism and threats to the animal control file, confirming that Max had been assaulted with spray directly to his face. And then the voicemail recording was played, the distorted voice hissing, "It's threat." And I saw the judge's eyes narrow as Daniels explained the timing of the call and the pattern of escalating harassment. When Karen was finally called to the stand, she attempted to perform her usual act of victimhood, dabbing at her eyes and insisting she had only ever acted to protect the neighborhood. But under cross-examination by my lawyer, her carefully constructed facade began to crack, especially when she was confronted with the fact that federal law explicitly protected service dogs under the Americans with Disabilities Act, meaning that spraying Max had not only been cruel, but a federal crime. And when she tried to deny it, the officer's written report and the corroborating neighbor testimony left her no room to maneuver. Watching her squirm, her voice rising in pitch as she accused me of faking a disability and claimed that Max was just a pet, I almost felt a pang of pity for her, but then I remembered the burning sting in Max's eyes that day, and the threatening voicemail promising harm to him, and all pity vanished, placed with the steady resolve that this was about justice. It's not just for me, but for everyone who had suffered under her bullying. As the trial continued, more neighbors stepped forward. Mr. Patel describing how Karen had harassed his grandchildren for riding their bikes on the sidewalk. Mrs. Thompson recounting the night she had overheard Karen boasting that she could get rid of anyone she didn't like through HOA rules, even a former HOA board member admitting under oath that Karen had pressured them to issue false violation notices against me, and the pattern that emerged was undeniable. This wasn't a case of a single disagreement. It was a sustained campaign of intimidation and abuse of power. When my lawyer delivered her closing argument, she framed it not only as a matter of personal harassment, but as a civil rights issue, reminding the court that people with service animals had a legal right to protection and that Karen's actions had violated both state and federal law. And by the time the judge called for a recess before delivering the ruling, I could already sense which way the scales were tipping. Outside the courtroom, several neighbors approached me, their faces full of nervous anticipation, and one of them whispered, "No matter what happens, you've already changed this place," which struck me deeply because it was truth. Fight had grown larger than me alone. It had become a reckoning for the whole community. When court resumed and the judge finally read his decision, the words felt like a weight lifting off my chest. The court found in my favor, granting a restraining order against Karen, levying fines for harassment and vandalism, and referring the matter of the service dog assault to federal authorities for further review. A rare but powerful acknowledgement that this was more than a neighborhood squabble. It was a criminal act with serious consequences. Karen sat frozen at her table, her mouth opening and closing soundlessly as the reality sank in. And though part of me expected her to explode into one of her infamous tantrums, she remained eerily silent, her face pale and rigid as though the fight had finally drained out of her. Walking out of that courtroom with Max at my side, greeted by nods and quiet cheers from my neighbors, I felt a surge of triumph, but also a profound sense of relief, because the fight that had consumed so many months of my life was finally moving toward its resolution. And though I knew it wasn't truly over until the federal case was addressed, I could finally breathe again, secure in the knowledge that the truth had been recognized and that justice, at least in part, had been served. The days after the animal control incident were some of the most surreal I had experienced since moving into that neighborhood. Because while on one hand the amount of support I received from neighbors was steadily growing, people stopping by to drop off cookies or handwritten notes, children asking shyly if they could pet Max, even one of the older couples telling me they had lived under Karen's intimidation for years but had never seen anyone stand up to her like I was doing. On the other hand, Karen's behavior was escalating into something darker, more frantic, as though she could sense that the walls were closing in and her usual tactics of fear and manipulation were no longer effective. And one afternoon, I discovered exactly how desperate she had become when I returned home from work to find bright red spray paint scrawled across my garage door. The words "dangerous dog" slanted and dripping like an accusation meant not just for me, but for the entire street to see. And while my stomach dropped at the sight, I immediately pulled out my phone, taking detailed photos before calling the police, who arrived within 15 minutes. And when Officer Daniels himself stepped out of the cruiser, his jaw tightened at the vandalism, muttering that Karen was practically building the case against herself at this point. Though he still methodically dusted for prints, filed the report, and reminded me not to clean the paint until the forensics team had finished their work. Standing there with Max pressed against my leg, I could see several neighbors gathered at the end of their driveways, watching with concern, and when one of them whispered loudly enough for me to hear, "Karen's finally gone too far," I felt an odd mix of validation and dread, because while it was reassuring to know others recognized the truth, it also confirmed that the situation had spiraled into something bigger than a simple neighborhood dispute. That night I couldn't sleep, lying awake listening to every creak of the house, every rustle outside, and Max, sensing my unease, kept pacing back and forth between the bedroom and the door, his instincts sharpening my own. And as much as I hated to admit it, fear was beginning to creep in, not just for myself but for him, because Karen's obsession with destroying us seemed to have no bottom. But the next morning, when I stepped outside and found two of my neighbors already working together to scrub away the spray paint from my garage, their faces set with determination, I felt something shift again, as though Karen's cruelty had not finally crossed a line in the community's eyes, and the solidarity they showed me gave me the strength to keep pushing forward. I decided it was time to take the battle to the next level, so I contacted my lawyer and formally filed a civil harassment suit against both Karen and the HOA board members who had supported her actions, attaching every piece of evidence I had collected, from the false notices to the assault report to the vandalism photos. And when my lawyer reviewed the thick stack of documents, she looked up at me and said with a kind of grim satisfaction that this wasn't just a case anymore. It was a turning point that could set a precedent for other people facing similar discrimination. Word spread quickly after the papers were served, and though Karen tried to spin it as me attacking the HOA, more and more neighbors quietly reached out to me, telling me they planned to testify if it went to court, and the shift in the NA atmosphere was unmistakable. Where once Karen had ruled through fear, now people were finding their voices, and the more she lashed out, the weaker her hold became. Of course, that only seemed to fuel her desperation. And one evening, while I was walking Max near the park, she stormed out of her house and started screaming across the street that I was abusing the system, that service dogs were just a scam, her voice shrill enough to draw people out onto their porches. But instead of backing her up, several neighbors yelled back, telling her to go inside and leave me alone. And I watched her freeze, stunned by the open defiance, before she stomped back into her house, slamming the door so hard it rattled. Later that night, though, my phone buzzed with a voicemail from an unknown number, and when I played it back, a distorted voice hissed that I should watch my back if I didn't want something to happen to my dog. The malice in the words chilling me to the bone, and though I had no proof it was Karen, the timing and the venom left little doubt in my mind. I forwarded the voicemail to Daniels immediately, and his response was swift: an official police report, an escalation of the harassment investigation, and a promise to increase patrols around my block. And as unsettling as it was, it also underscored just how far this situation had escalated beyond a simple HOA dispute, was now a matter of safety, law, and justice. Through it all, Max remained my anchor, steady and calm, even when I was frayed at the edges, and I often caught myself marveling at his resilience. How despite being directly attacked by Karen in the beginning, he never lost his gentle spirit. And in that quiet strength, I found the courage to keep fighting, reminding myself over and over that giving in would only prove Karen right. And that was something I could never allow. The days that followed the HOA meeting carried an undercurrent of tension that never quite dissipated, so the neighborhood itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what Karen would do next. And though I tried to go about my life as normally as possible, I could feel her presence like a shadow always lingering nearby. From the way her blinds twitched whenever I stepped outside to the pointed whispers that trailed off whenever I walked past a group of board members chatting on the sidewalk. But instead of shrinking back, I made it a point to hold my head high, walking Max proudly around the block every morning and evening. His calm demeanor a silent rebuttal to every lie Karen had spewed about him, and I could see the effect it had on the neighbors. Some stopped to smile or wave. A few even came over to pat Max's head and say how well-behaved he was. And every small gesture of kindness was like another crack in the wall of fear Karen had built around herself. But Karen wasn't about to let her control slip away quietly, and it wasn't long before her next move came. This time in the form of a formal notice taped to my door, accusing me of endangering community safety and demanding that Max be permanently removed from the neighborhood within 10 days. A notice signed not just by Karen but also by 2 other board members who were clearly still under her sway. And though the threat made my blood boil, I carefully filed the letter away with the rest of the growing pile of evidence, then immediately forwarded a copy to Officer Daniels and my ADA contact, both of whom assured me once again that the notice was completely unenforceable and actually strengthened my case against the HOA, since it showed a continued pattern of harassment in violation of federal law. The following afternoon, Daniels himself stopped by, his expression serious, as he explained that while the criminal side of Karen's assault case was moving forward, the federal civil side regarding the ADA violations was also starting to gain traction, and he warned me to be vigilant because people like Karen often became more reckless when they felt their power slipping. And his words proved prophetic sooner than I expected, because just 2 nights later, I woke up to Max barking furiously at the back door, his body rigid with alertness, and when I flicked on the porch light, I saw a shadow darting away through the yard. It's too quick to catch, but leaving behind a set of muddy footprints that led straight from Karen's side of the property line. And my stomach clenched with the realization that she or someone acting on her behalf had been skulking around in the dark, likely looking for some way to intimidate me further, maybe even to hurt Max again. I called Daniels immediately, and within minutes a patrol car was circling the block, shining a spotlight into yards and questioning anyone still awake. But though they couldn't find the intruder, the officer who took my statement agreed the footprints were suspicious, snapping photos to include in the ongoing investigation. And as I watched them work, a new kind of determination settled over me, not just to protect myself and Max, but to make sure Karen's pattern of cruelty and harassment was exposed for everyone to see. The very next day, I printed out copies of the ADA guidelines regarding service animals, stapled them to a brief summary of what had happened with Karen, and quietly delivered them to every mailbox in the neighborhood, not with the intent of shaming her directly, but to educate my neighbors about the truth. And the response was more powerful than I anticipated within hours. I began receiving supportive texts and emails from residents thanking me for clarifying their rights, and some even confessed they had felt bullied by Karen and the board before, but had been too afraid to speak up. And as the tide of support grew, I began to see more and more cracks in her armor. That evening, as I walked Max, I noticed Karen standing on her porch, her face flushed with fury as she watched neighbors wave to me, some even crossing the street to say hello, and I could see the realization dawning in her eyes that she was losing her grip on the very people she had once controlled with fear. Her retaliation when it came was vicious this time. She called animal control, filing a false report that Max was dangerous and had bitten her. And though the officers who arrived were professional, I could see their skepticism the moment. Max greeted them with a wagging tail and sat calmly at my side. And when I produced his paperwork, including the vet's report and the ongoing police case, they quickly concluded the call was malicious and made a note in their system to disregard further frivolous reports from Karen, though the warning look they gave me made it clear they expected she would try again. That night, as I sat on the floor with Max's head resting in my lap, I couldn't help but feel the exhaustion seeping into my bones. But alongside it was a fire I hadn't felt in years. The kind that comes from standing on the right side of something important. And I knew that no matter how much Karen schemed or lashed out, she was only digging herself deeper into the hole she had made. Because the law, my neighbors, and most importantly, the truth, were finally on my side. But even then, a part of me couldn't shake the question of just how far she was willing to go. 8. And as I double-checked my locks before heading to bed, I promised myself I wouldn't let my guard down again, because if there was one thing I had learned about Karen, it was that she never stopped until someone made her. The following morning started deceptively quiet. The kind of calm that made me wonder if Karen had finally decided to retreat. But as I poured coffee into my mug and glanced out the window, I saw her across the street, arms folded, glaring at my house as though sheer hatred could burn through the walls, and I knew that silence from her never meant peace. It only meant planning, so I tried to keep my guard up. Though it was difficult not to let my nerves fray when Max stiffened beside me and gave a low growl. His instincts picking up on tension I couldn't yet see, and I reassured him softly, reminding myself that he had already endured her cruelty once and still stood strong, so I needed to do the same. A knock at the door startled both of us, and when I opened it, I found Officer Daniels again, this time with a small folder tucked under his arm. His face set in that professional mask, but with a hint of reassurance in his eyes as he stepped inside at my invitation. And he explained that they had followed up with Martha and Rick, who had corroborated my story, and that they were also in the process of formally questioning Karen, who had already attempted to spin the incident as self-defense, claiming Max had lunged at her, but Daniels assured me her story didn't hold water because of the witnesses and the clear physical evidence of chemical spray residue on Max's fur that the veterinarian had documented in her report, which I had also provided to the police. And hearing him lay out the case so matter-of-factly gave me a momentary sense of relief. Though Daniels was quick to caution me that people like Karen rarely accepted accountability and she might escalate before things calmed down. True to his warning, later that afternoon I received an email from the HOA board summoning me to an urgent compliance meeting to discuss repeated violations regarding my dog. And though part of me wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it, another part recognized it for what it was, yet another intimidation tactic orchestrated by Karen, who was clearly leaning on her friends in the HOA to pressure me into submission. But what she hadn't counted on was that I was already armed with the law on my side, and I immediately forwarded the email to both Officer Daniels and the ADA representative I had spoken to earlier, asking for their advice. The ADA rep responded almost instantly, reminding me that HOAs cannot enforce rules that override federal protections, and even suggesting that I bring a formal complaint against the board itself if they continued their harassment, while Daniels called to advise me not to attend the meeting alone, offering to connect me with a legal aid group if I needed backup. And though the idea of standing in front of a hostile board made my stomach twist, I knew deep down that facing them head-on might be the only way to expose Karen's abuse of power once and for all. That night, as I walked Max through the neighborhood under the dim glow of the streetlights, the air felt heavy with tension, and when I passed Karen's house, I noticed her curtains twitch as if she were watching me, and a shiver ran down my spine because it was clear she wasn't going to let this go. But as Max leaned gently against my leg for reassurance, I realized I wasn't afraid anymore, just angry and determined to see justice done. The day of the HOA meeting arrived faster than I expected. I dressed carefully, choosing plain but professional clothes to project calm confidence, then clipped Max's harness on him because if they wanted to accuse him of being a menace, they would have to look him in the eye while he sat quietly and obediently by my side, a living refutation of their lies. When I entered the community hall, the board members sat in a row at the front, with Karen smugly positioned in a chair nearby as though she were the guest of honor, her expression full of smug victory, but that smugness faltered the moment she Saw Max trot calmly beside me and sit down without a single bark or whine, his head high and eyes alert. And I almost smiled at the way her lips pursed in frustration at the sight of him behaving better than most humans in the room. The president of the board cleared his throat and launched into a list of alleged complaints,
Most of which were laughably exaggerated claims that Max barked at all hours.
That he ran loose through the neighborhood that he had attacked.
Karen, and as I listened, I felt my anger rise because the blatant lies were so easily disproven. And when they finally finished, I calmly placed a folder of documents on the table, including Max's certification papers, the veterinarian's medical report, copies of the threatening HOA letter, and the official complaint I had already filed with the police in Ada, explaining in clear, steady words that not only were their accusations false, but their attempt to force me to remove my service dog was a violation of federal law, punishable by steep penalties, and that both my attorney and law enforcement were already involved. A ripple of unease spread across the board members, some shifting uncomfortably in their seats, clearly realizing they had overstepped. While Karen's face turned red with fury, and she tried to interject with a tirade about neighborhood standards, but the president raised a hand sharply to cut her off, his voice tense as he said they would need to review the documentation before taking any further action. Though the meeting ended without a clear resolution, I walked out feeling lighter than I had in weeks, because for the first time, it was Karen who looked cornered, her power slipping through her fingers as her lies unraveled. That evening, as I sat on my porch watching Max snooze peacefully at my feet, Martha and Rick stopped by with warm smiles, congratulating me for standing my ground. And Martha said softly, "She's finally losing her grip, everyone saw today. That she can't bully her way into control anymore." And though I knew the battle wasn't fully over, I felt a new sense of solidarity with my neighbors, who seemed emboldened to speak out now that someone had shown it was possible to push back. Later, as I went inside and prepared for bed, I heard Karen outside yelling on her phone again, her voice shrill with frustration as she ranted about lawyers and revenge. And though it sent a small chill through me, I no longer felt afraid, because she was only lashing out blindly, her power crumbling. And deep down I knew she had already lost the war, she just didn't realize it yet. The next morning, I was still shaken by what had happened, though I tried to push it out of my mind and carry on with my day. But the nervous tension remained as I clipped Max's leash onto his harness and prepared to take him for his morning walk, his eager wagging tail helping calm my nerves as I opened the door and stepped outside into the crisp air, only to spot Karen lurking near her driveway with a fake smile plastered across her face as though nothing had happened the day before. And the audacity of it nearly made me laugh, because she was acting as though she hadn't just sprayed a defenseless service dog with chemicals, but I ignored her and kept walking, only for her to call out in that mocking tone of hers, "Oh, good morning, hope your mutt's feeling better." Maybe now he won't mess up our neighborhood. And I had to bite my tongue to stop from snapping back, because every bone in my body wanted to scream at her. But I knew better than to give her the satisfaction of seeing me lose my composure. So I calmly walked Max down the sidewalk, just letting him sniff around and do his routine, while I mulled over what steps I needed to take because I couldn't allow her behavior to escalate unchecked. It's not just for Max's sake, but for the principle of it all. And I promised myself that I would not be intimidated, even though Karen thrived on intimidation. As we looped back toward the house, I noticed two other neighbors, Martha and Rick, standing by their lawn, talking quietly but watching me approach, their expressions shifting when they saw Max walking steadily beside me and Martha broke into a relieved smile, saying, "I'm so glad he's okay. We were worried when we saw what she did yesterday. That woman's out of control." And Rick nodded firmly, adding, "You should press charges. Seriously, that's abuse in service. Dogs are protected by law. You know that, right?" And though I already knew it, hearing someone else point it out gave me a strange sense of support. Because for once I realized Karen didn't have the whole neighborhood under her thumb the way she wanted to believe. But instead she had sowed fear and annoyance among them for years. And perhaps now was the time to stand up not just for myself but for everyone else who had been bullied by her antics. When I returned inside, I sat at the kitchen table with Max curled up faithfully at my feet and dialed the local non-emergency police number, explaining in detail what had happened, from the moment I stepped outside to when she sprayed him and then taunted me afterward, and the officer on the other end listened carefully before saying, "Ma'am, I want you to know you did the right thing calling us. Harming a service animal isn't just animal cruelty. It's a federal crime under the ADA. So we're going to send someone over to take a full report." And the weight of those words settled over me like a protective shield, because now it was no longer just my word against Karen's, but the law itself standing between us. And Max raised his head as if sensing my relief, thumping his tail lightly against the floor in reassurance. When the officer arrived later that afternoon, he introduced himself as Officer Daniels, a tall, no-nonsense man with a calm but serious demeanor. And as I recounted the incident step by step, he scribbled notes on his pad, occasionally asking clarifying questions about the type of spray she used, what time of day it occurred, and whether there were witnesses, and I made sure to mention Martha and Rick, who had seen at least part of the aftermath and could confirm my version of events, while Daniels nodded and said he'd follow up with them, then leaned down to gently scratch Max's head, remarking, "He's a good dog, and he's protected. We take this seriously." His words lit a fire of determination inside me. Because for too long, Karen had acted as if rules applied to everyone but her. And now she had crossed a line she couldn't dance her way back over. The officer promised they would be opening an investigation, which might include speaking directly with Karen. And though the thought of her retaliation made my stomach twist, I knew there was no other way forward. And when Daniels left, I immediately felt the weight of what was about to unfold. Because this wasn't some petty HOA fine she could shrug off. This was potentially a federal charge. That evening, as I tried to relax with a book, Max suddenly lifted his head again, ears pricked at the sound of something outside. And when I looked out the window, I caught sight of Karen pacing in her yard, muttering angrily into her phone, while gesturing toward my house. And though I couldn't hear her words, her frantic body language said enough, because she knew the walls were closing in. And instead of reflecting on her own wrongdoing, she was already scheming to twist the narrative, likely planning to call the HOA president or anyone else she thought might back her up. But what she didn't realize was that the law didn't bend the way HOA rules sometimes did. Sure enough, the next day I received a letter slid under my door, not even mailed properly, but shoved there crudely, with the HOA letterhead at the top and a smugly written statement, accusing me of keeping a dangerous animal that threatened the safety of the community, demanding I remove him immediately or face fines. And my blood boiled at the sheer audacity of the move, because not only was Max harmless and highly trained, but service animals are legally protected under federal law, and the HOA had no authority to override that, which meant Karen had clearly weaponized her influence to get the board to do her bidding. And instead of intimidating me, it only hardened my resolve, because now I had even more evidence to present to the authorities. Of her ongoing harassment campaign, I made copies of the letter, emailed them directly to Officer Daniels, and also contacted the ADA hotline, where a representative assured me that they could support me if necessary with formal complaints against both Karen and the HOA.
And though
I was exhausted from the constant stress, a quiet strength rose in me as I realized I wasn't alone in this fight anymore, because Karen had finally overplayed her hand. Later that afternoon, Martha knocked on my door with a determined expression and said, "I heard about the letter. She's trying to paint you as the problem, but you're not alone in this. Plenty of us have had enough of her," and she recounted how Karen once fined her for having her recycling bin visible for 10 minutes too long, and how she harassed Rick about the color of his shutters. And in that moment, I realized Karen's empire of fear was crumbling because people were starting to speak up, perhaps emboldened by the fact that someone had finally taken legal action against her. Still, the fight was far from over, because Karen wasn't the type to back down quietly. And as night fell, I sat on the couch, stroking Max's soft fur, while the hum of the refrigerator filled the silence, bracing myself for whatever retaliation she would try next, but also feeling a flicker of hope. Because for once, she wasn't just up against me, she was up against the law itself. That was a battle she couldn't win, no matter how many letters she shoved under doors or complaints. She filed through the HOA. The neighborhood had seen its share of drama, but nothing could have prepared me for the day when my neighbor Karen decided to cross a line that would turn the entire street upside down. And before I tell you what she did, let me tell you this: if you've ever had to deal with someone who thinks they're above the law, or believe that the HOA gives them special rights to bully people, then make sure you stick with this story until the end, because what happened next not only changed my life, but also taught Karen a lesson she never expected. And if you enjoy real stories where justice catches up to the people who think they can get away with anything, make sure to follow and subscribe, because this one will shock you. Now let's get back to that day when everything started with nothing more than me walking my service dog, Max, down the quiet street we had lived on 4 years. Max wasn't just any dog. He was my trained companion, a Labrador retriever with a calm temperament and a sharp sense for when I needed help. I had served years in the military, and ever since I came home, Max had been by my side, guiding me through anxiety, grounding me during panic attacks, and reminding me that even on the hardest days, I wasn't alone. Everyone in the neighborhood knew Max, and most people adored him. Kids would come over to pet him. Older neighbors would smile when he trotted by, and even the mailman would bring him a biscuit every once in a while. But not Karen. Karen was the type of person who saw anything she didn't control as a threat. And she had been at war with me ever since the HOA meeting, when I dared to challenge her over the ridiculous fines she had been pushing on the entire community. She thought she ruled the HOA board, and she made sure everyone knew it. From the height of your lawn to the type of flowers you planted in your front yard, nothing escaped her scrutiny. But her dislike for Max wasn't about HOA rules. It was personal. She had once told me straight to my face that dogs don't belong in this neighborhood. So when I explained to her calmly that Max wasn't just a pet, but a federally protected service animal, she scoffed and said, "That's just an excuse to get away with things." I brushed her off most of the time because, honestly, I had bigger battles to fight than some bitter woman who thought she could police everyone around her. What she did next went far beyond her usual harassment. That afternoon, I was just walking Max, minding my own business, when Karen stormed out of her front door, holding a bright red spray bottle in her hand. I thought at first it was some kind of cleaning solution or bug repellent, and figured she was just doing some yard work. But the look in her eyes was one I'll never forget: cold, sharp, and filled with a strange satisfaction, like she had been waiting for this moment. She marched toward me, and before I could react, she sprayed Max directly in the face with whatever was in that bottle. My heart stopped. Max yelped in pain and stumbled back, pawing at his eyes, his ears twitching. In confusion, I dropped to my knees immediately, holding his head, trying to figure out what she had sprayed him with. The smell hit me next to vinegar, ammonia, and something else caustic that burned my nostrils. It wasn't harmless water. She had actually doused my service dog with a chemical spray. Rage boiled inside me as I looked up at her, still clutching Max as he whimpered. "What the hell is wrong with you?" I shouted, my voice shaking with both fury and disbelief. Karen just folded her arms and said with a smug smirk, "Maybe now you'll think twice about bringing that filthy mutt into our neighborhood." This isn't a kennel? I couldn't believe what I was hearing. This wasn't some petty HOA nonsense anymore. She had just attacked a federally protected service dog, a crime that carried serious consequences. I told her she had just committed a federal offense. She laughed in my face, waving her hand dismissively like I was exaggerating. She said, "Oh, please, don't act like your silly mutt is some kind of national treasure. I don't care what papers you have. I'm not living next to a dog." She turned on her heel and walked back toward her house like she had just taken out the trash, leaving me kneeling on the pavement, holding Max and trembling with anger. I pulled my phone out and called animal control first, explaining the situation while trying to calm Max down. They told me to rinse his eyes immediately and that they'd send someone out. But as soon as I hung up, I realized this wasn't something I was going to let slide. I dialed the police. When the dispatcher picked up, I told them exactly what had just happened, that my service dog had been attacked with chemicals by a neighbor who knew full well what she was doing. The dispatcher didn't hesitate. She said an officer would be sent right away, and she reminded me to keep Max comfortable and document everything. As I sat there on the curb, rinsing Max's eyes with bottled water from my bag, neighbors began to come out of their houses, drawn by the commotion. Some gasped when they saw Max. Others shook their heads knowingly, muttering about Karen finally going too far. One older neighbor even said, "I've warned her before, but she doesn't listen. She thinks she owns this whole street." By the time the first police car pulled up, Karen had come back outside, acting like she was the victim. She pointed at me and shouted, "He's making a scene again. He's harassing me. He's using that dog to intimidate people." Officers didn't look convinced. They approached me first, saw Max trembling at my side, and immediately grew serious when I explained what had happened. When I told them Karen had sprayed him with chemicals, one officer asked to see the bottle. I pointed to where she had dropped it on her porch, and the officer picked it up carefully, sniffing it and wrinkling his nose at the harsh smell. Karen started to protest, saying it was just homemade cleaning spray, but the officer turned to her and said flatly, "Ma'am, if what he's saying is true, then you just committed a federal crime. Attacking a service animal is punishable by law." Karen's face drained of color, and for the first time since I'd known her, she looked genuinely shaken. But she still tried to argue, saying Max wasn't really a service dog, that I was lying, that anyone could buy a vest online. I pulled out Max's papers, his registration, and even a letter from my doctor that confirmed his role as my service animal. The officers didn't hesitate, they told Karen. She was being detained for questioning, and that animal control would be seizing the spray for evidence. The look on her face when the words federal offense were repeated was priceless. The smug arrogance she had always carried was gone, replaced by wide-eyed fear. And I knew in that moment that this was just the beginning of a long battle, one where the law was finally on my side.